when our marriage was at its worst, nobody in the church had a clue. We had 3 kids, we had a dog, we lived in a nice 2-story house.
Yeah, so in about 2004, we found ourselves in a place where we were really struggling with our marriage, and until we decided to let somebody know. Nobody had a clue. Had 3 daughters, house, a good duck hunting dog, all was well. So people thought. We came to a place where we realized this may not work out unless we get some help. Had a conversation with Bud Ross, who said, "You're too gone for me, buddy. See somebody else." And we ended up with a Christian counselor in Edmond named Dr. Jim Talley. We spent over a year going back and forth to see him every other week. We would have work to do during the week, and we'd talk to each other, and then we would go meet with him for a week. Some of it, we were at a point where he wouldn't let us get there together, which was interesting.
During that time, or before everything just kind of crumbled, we seemed like we had everything going on, like everything was fine. We were at church every Sunday, every Wednesday. We were involved, but our marriage was falling apart, and got to the point where I wasn't sure if we were going to make it. I wasn't sure I wanted to make it. I don't know that he was sure he wanted to.
What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. I want to say thank you to all the people this month who have shared their story as part of this sermon series and been transparent. Why do we tell these old stories? The most basic reason is because they're true, because they happened. But because we keep living them over and over and over again, and yet every time we do, we think we're the only ones. We think we're the only ones in the room right now going through it, and we think we're the only people in all of history who've gone through it. But what we see when we stop and listen to each other, and when we read the old stories we've kept sacred in our scriptures, is that the struggles we face are not only not new, not only not unique, they're nearly universal. That all of us in the human experience face those days of challenge and conflict, whether it's in a marriage, whether it's somewhere else in a family, whether it's in the workplace, in the church, in our community, in our society, something well beyond our control or something that was entirely our fault. We find ourselves in moments of crisis and conflict where you just throw up your hands and say, "This is awful. I don't want this. How is it going to end?" Where you feel like you're in a moment that is so bad you can't imagine any other ending than what it is. You could imagine running from it. You can't imagine it being different. All of us have encountered some moment like that in our lives. And what the old stories tell us is that this is simply universal. Human stories always involve conflict. Some of the first human stories involve conflict. You remember this one? Cain spoke to Abel, his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. One of the first stories in our Bible is about hostility and conflict between two people who, in theory, should have loved each other. All human stories involve conflict. It's universal, maybe several of them. And most of them involve other people. There are a few that don't. And And here you speak of, great literature. Even if you're making up a story, it usually involves two people in an argument. There's just a few exceptions to that. You could read some Hemingway maybe and pull out Old Man and the Sea. And what's that conflict? Well, it's a guy and a fish. Kind of unusual. Fish, he said softly aloud, I will stay with you until I die. Anybody here have a fish conflict? Well, that one's kind of unusual. Makes for an interesting story, but it's not the way they usually go. Most of our conflicts are not with things as metaphorical as the ocean or a fish or things like that, once in a while. More often, it's with the people that we see every day, people that we love or want to love, and yet we can't find a way to make it easy. And we're surprised by that when we do marital counseling and so forth. I'm not very good at it, but I do a little bit of it. But one thing I hear most often is, it ought to be easy. It shouldn't be this hard. And we have this idea in our head that if you really love someone or you care about another person, whether again it's family, parent-child relationship, or a marriage, that it ought to just work. And one thing the old stories tell us, and every story tells us, is it's not that way. Human stories involve conflict, usually several of them. Story I want to focus on a little bit today is the story of Joseph, which comes from Genesis chapter 37 and following. It's a story a lot like Cain and Abel. It starts out about brothers, and it involves hostility and conflict in a family that should have been close-knit and full of love. Instead, they have animosity. The text says, now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his sons because he was the son of his old age. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Who's at fault in this story? We could blame old Jacob. We wouldn't be wrong in that sense. He showed favoritism, which is going to get you into trouble as a parent. We know that. But if you want a little empathy, can you understand why he showed favoritism? You know that Jacob's own story was full of conflict. Married a woman he didn't want to marry, got kind of hoodwinked into it, had a lot of children by her, but didn't get a child by the wife that he loved until old age, and that child was Joseph. And because his love for that woman was special, his love for that child was special. And he could have been a better dad and not let the others sense that, but he's a human, and his affection for Joseph became apparent. And he did things that got their attention. Gives him, if you read some of the verses I left out, gives him the coat of many colors, we call it. In Hebrew, we're not even sure what that is in the text. It might be a long-sleeve coat. We're not exactly sure what colors were in it, but it's a coat of significance. It wasn't what a workman wore, short-sleeve shirt to go out in the field and work. It's what the boss wore. And he gives it to Joseph. Not the oldest, not the second oldest, not the third oldest, to Joseph. And so his brothers hated him. Was it Joseph's fault? Did Joseph do anything at this point to make his dad love him more? Being a good kid or not, I don't know. He didn't ask to be born of Rachel instead of Leah. This wasn't something that he concocted at this point. But through a series of events, they just come to hate him. And that hate worked itself out first in just the cold shoulder, the silent treatment. They couldn't even speak peacefully to him. Everything they said was hostile. And I'm sure if you were living in that tent, I don't know how big a tent it was, but it wasn't a fun tent to live in. Maybe they had several tents, but if you were living with that family, you'd say, this is awful. How's this going to end? And then it got worse. Joseph had a dream that he perceived was from God. He didn't ask for it. He had a dream that he perceived was from God and spoke it out loud and said, hey, God blessed me with a dream. And the brothers said, of course he did. Of course, Dad's favorite is God's favorite too. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. And I'm sure they said, "This is just awful. How's it going to end?" Well, it got worse, because then he told them what the dream was about. He said, "Oh, no, it's a dream from God. And in the dream, I'm going to be your boss," which was their worst nightmare anyway. That's what they had feared all along. And he says, "Yeah, that's what God said's going to happen. You're all going to bow down to me." How do they take that? About like you'd guess. His brother said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. They hated him. They hated him even more. They hated him even more. And people would have said, "This is awful. How's it going to end?" And it just went on and got worse and worse. And one day they see him coming out to check on them, coming from the distance, and he came near to them. And what had been just words and hostility comes to violent intentions, and they conspired against him to kill him. You may have had a relationship in your life where it crossed your mind that you could do some harm to that person. That's usually pretty far down the road. But even that, there's a big chasm between "I wish you were dead" and "I would act to kill you." And then it got worse. They conspired to kill him, and more or less did. Then said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we'll say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams." That's very detailed. They had been thinking about that one. You understand? I don't think they came up with that plan on the spur of the moment. They had been thinking that one through. And then they enacted it. Now, if you read the story, it doesn't quite play out like that. They decide first just to leave him in a pit for a while. That'll teach him not to kill him. But then one of the other brother comes around and sells him into slavery instead. That'll teach him. But just from bad to worse, to worse, to worse, to worse. What are we learning from this story? This isn't fun. What are we learning from this story? The first thing I'd want you to know about the conflict in your life is that you're not alone, that it's a common human experience, and in those experiences, conflicts always get worse before they get better. It's the nature of conflicts. Stories aren't short. There's a moment where it seems like it's as bad it can be. Just you wait. It can get worse. And it seems like it does. And just when you think you're at your breaking point, boy, this is a really hope-filled sermon today, it can get worse. For Joseph, it got progressively worse and worse and worse. I don't want to minimize the conflict. It's real. Anybody who tells you, "Oh, it's okay," it's not. It's awful. It's unpleasant. And you begin to doubt whether it could ever be any other way. Worse, I'm going to tell you, this is only the first chapter of Joseph's story. These aren't even necessarily the worst things that happened to him. For sake of getting through the sermon, I've got to summarize a little. But for those of you that have read it, the story of Joseph is just incredible. Joseph himself is taken up out of the pit later and sold into slavery. So here's a young man who, and you can say maybe he was a little egotistical, maybe it's some of it's self-inflicted, but more or less most of this just kind of fell in his lap. He didn't ask for it. Certainly didn't do anything to deserve murder or being sold into slavery. But here's a young man who went from being the father's favorite, the fair-haired boy, now being sold into slavery. He's going to be in a new place, in a new land, where he's not the favorite, he's the least favorite, where he knows nothing and nobody, where I can't guarantee you from the start that he could even speak the language, where he is going to be treated like chattel. He will be a possession that is owned and sold to the highest bidder, and there is no exit plan for that story. Old slaves don't get a retirement fund. For Joseph, he looked at what he had ahead of him, and it went from bad to worse, to worse, to worse. Joseph ends up as a slave in the house of an Egyptian man named Potiphar. And there's a moment in there where things seem like they might get a little better. He's a slave, but he is a well-liked slave. He really is the fair-haired boy. He really is somebody who apparently is likable, that he works hard, and people seem to admire him in any situation he finds himself in. So Potiphar puts him in charge of his household, and he kind of makes lemonade out of some really terrible Egyptian lemons. And things seem to look up a little bit for him until he catches the eye of a woman we simply know as Potiphar's wife. And Potiphar's wife tries to seduce the young man Joseph. And Joseph, you have to admit, being a remarkable young man with more character than anybody has a right to, refuses her advances to the point that it makes Potiphar's wife angry. She's not used to being told no, certainly not by the help. And so she concocts a little scheme and tells her husband that this slave has made a mockery of her. Fun trivial fact just for fun today. The text of Genesis says she told her husband a story. It's the first time the word story is used in the Bible. She made up a little story. Not the story of what had happened, but the one she'd like to tell. And she used that story to get Joseph into trouble. Potiphar decides it's smarter to keep his wife happy than his slaves. And Joseph goes from bad to worse, and he ends up in a prison cell. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. The verse there is kind of emphatic. Did you notice that? It could have just said, if you were writing this story, how would you say it? They put Joseph in prison. That's all the information you need. How did the verse say it? Put him in prison, the place where the prisoners go, in prison. So is it getting the point across? It says it three different ways. And even the word prison doesn't do justice. Prisons are awful, dark, and depressing places full of despair in the modern world. In the ancient world, I don't even know if we should apply the word prison to it. Dungeon would be closer. This man is put into a dark pit of hell that few people in human history have ever known. And the despair he must have felt, far from home, far from anything he knew. And somehow it got worse. While he's there, everybody likes Joseph. And so the prison master puts Joseph in charge of the prison. He trusts him so much, the text says, he stopped paying attention. Whatever Joseph did, you take care of it. The prison guard didn't have anything to do with it. Complete and total trust. And Joseph interacts with some of the prisoners. Some of the prisoners start to have dreams, and Joseph interprets their dreams. And he says to one of them, the meaning of your dream is that you'll be restored to your job in the house of Pharaoh. And when you get there, would you please remember me? Here's a young man who feels forgotten. Would you please remember me? My father thinks I'm dead. My brothers have forgotten about me. Nobody cares that I exist. Would you please remember me and say my name to Pharaoh? And the man says, of course I will. And of course he does it. The text tells us the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And again, you notice the emphasis. Could have just said, didn't remember him. No, he forgot him. Completely, totally failed in one thing of kindness he could have done for another human being. And then, to make sure you get the scope of the story, it says 2 whole years pass. One of the I don't want to say shortcomings of the Bible, that sounds bad. One of the struggles of reading the Bible well is that you turn a page and it takes you 5 seconds to go from one page to the next, but 2 years might have passed in the story. And so you're reading through the story of Joseph, And you kind of lose track of these aren't moments of despair, these are years of despair and hopelessness. Where in each one of these moments, he must have thought, this is awful, and this is the only way it will ever be. And then it gets worse. Spoiler, it does get better. I won't leave you with a miserable story today, I promise. But here's my question to you at this point in the story. If you had looked at this story, at any point in this story, could this story end well? Any rational, practical, reasonable person would say no. In fact, at several points in the story, you would say it sounds like the story is already over. And wouldn't that make a perfectly good story? There once was a young man whose father doted on him, his brothers killed him, the end. Or there once was a young man whose father doted on him, his brothers wanted to kill him, they sold him into slavery instead, the end. There once was a young man whose father doted on him, his brothers hated him, they wanted to kill him, they sold him into slavery, he went into the house of an Egyptian, and there he was further betrayed and put into prison, the end. There once was a young man whose father doted on him, his brothers wanted to kill him, they sold him into slavery, he went into an Egyptian house where he was betrayed and put into prison, and finally forgotten for years without end, the end. Those are all perfectly believable stories. There is no point in that story where you would think this is going to get better. And that's kind of the point. At no point in this story does it really seem like it's going to be okay. Until it is. When you're in the middle of the hard part of the story, it feels like this is all there is. Of course it does. That's the part you're in. But what the old stories teach us is that's not the way they have to end. And though it always takes longer than we want to believe, there is often another page coming in the story. If you keep reading Genesis, you may know what happens next. Pharaoh starts to dream dreams, and none of the wise men of Egypt can interpret those dreams. And that guy who for 2 years had forgotten Joseph's existence says, there was something I was supposed to remember. Was it to turn off the coffee pot? No, it was Joseph can interpret dreams. And there's a Hebrew young man down in the prison cells you ought to talk to. And they summon up Joseph. And in a bizarre turn of events, what was it that got Joseph in trouble in the first place? Dreaming dreams. And what gets him out of trouble at the end of the story? Interpreting dreams. He explains to Pharaoh the meaning of his disturbing dreams. And Pharaoh is just amazed by the wisdom and character of this young man. Everybody likes Joseph. He says, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. That's a bit of a reversal. From the pit of despair all the way up to the second most powerful man on the face of the earth. Anybody see that coming? Well, some of you did because you read about it in Sunday school when you were a kid. But if you hadn't, if you were reading this story for the first time, no one would have guessed that comes next. But what I want you to think about as you're encountering this story is how it felt along the way. If you only read this page, you would never believe the rest of the story. Do you understand? If you met Joseph, think about any point in his life. If you met Joseph when he's the favorite son, you never would imagine what happened next. If you met him when he was sold into slavery, you never would have imagined what happened next. If you met him in a prison, you wouldn't say, you might have said, this is a nice young man. You wouldn't say, he's going to be in charge of Egypt soon. At none of the bad times could you have ever guessed the good. And when you finally get to the good, if you walked into a room in Egypt and your first introduction to Joseph was, this is Joseph. He's second in charge. He's the lieutenant Pharaoh. He's second in command of the most powerful empire on the face of the earth at that time and place. Oh, by the way, he was in prison like yesterday. You wouldn't believe that. You would believe none of that. See the problem? We see little moments of it and don't see the story. So when things are bad for us, we can't imagine they could ever be better. And then we see people who seem like they have it all together, which, by the way, they often don't. But even if they do, doesn't mean they had it all together yesterday. We see little moments of it. We don't know how it worked. I was at a funeral for a friend of mine several years ago. This was one of my favorite people on the whole planet Earth. Name was Nick Nichols. Can't make this up. Name was Nick Nichols. And I was there for his funeral and also later his wife, Maxine, an older couple that kind of treated me like grandparents. They were grandparents to me. A wonderful old couple. And my dad preached the funeral because he had been their preacher back in years gone by. And I was in charge of the song leading because that's what a dutiful young preacher's son does. You go and you lead the singing at the funerals. So I was there and I was listening to my dad preach this funeral. And I remember what Dad was trying to do, and I don't fault my dad for this. This is not critical, but just something that occurred to me at the time. He was trying to celebrate their marriage, like as a good example for other people in the room. And he said, this marriage stood the test of time. This marriage didn't break up. There was no unfaithfulness in this marriage. There was no this, and he went on and on and on about how good the marriage was. And I remember thinking, I don't actually know if that's true or not. And nobody does. No one would ever know what they went through. We only know they stayed together till the end. No one will ever know what days of trouble they faced and what secrets they held together as a couple. We only know they made it at the end. But what we do, we all do it. We see the end result and we say, wow, that must have been perfect. 50 years of marital bliss. They never had an argument. I actually know better than some of that. I know the reason that Nick became a Christian was because he had a terrible car accident driving out to a well site. And Maxine decided this was the time for him to hear about Jesus. So while he was near to paralyzed in a hospital bed, she began to read to him from the scriptures and he couldn't leave the room. And she carried on until he believed some of it and eventually became a fine Christian man. Maybe a little manipulative, maybe a little bit taking advantage of the situation, but she said, I got a captive audience. You ain't going anywhere. I'm going to tell you about Jesus. And she did. But they don't put that part in the funeral story. You just know he was a pillar of his church, lived an amazing life. I'm telling you, you can't know the story by how it ends. The same way you can't know the ending from the middle. These stories, they all have different pieces throughout. If you're in a bad spot, it doesn't mean it's going to stay that way. And if you've seen people that seem like they have it together, it doesn't mean that they actually do, and it doesn't mean that they did yesterday. Because every one of us has been through these moments. Joseph's isn't even done yet. For what it's worth, there's a little more. And I'll end with these thoughts. Joseph's brothers reunite with him in Egypt. And a relationship that you would think was like Cain and Abel, an unfixable relationship, begins to be healed. They embrace, they hug each other, tears are shed. But even that's not the end. Eventually, they're reunited. Joseph reunited with his father, and then his father dies. And the brothers begin to realize, maybe the only thing keeping Joseph from throwing us in prison was Dad. Now that Dad's gone, what's going to happen? And they go to Joseph, and when they saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to them. They're still living way back in the story. They're still imagining the things they carry around, the tremendous guilt, a well-earned guilt, of things they had done to their brother, and they think, we know how this goes next. But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." What had Joseph learned? That it's a long, long story. And somewhere in that story, in every dark chapter, he began to see that God was at work. In fact, he began to hope that God had been at work before he even got there. That the darkest moments in the chapters in the story are only the chapters that precede the turning point, where what God has in store begins to be revealed. That there are far, far better things ahead than any we leave behind. Our struggle in these stories as we live them is accepting that God is already working on it. When you're in the dark spot, you think you're the only one, and that means in heaven and in earth. You think you're the only human going through it, and you don't think there's anybody in heaven who cares. This is God's story. And you cannot imagine the effort he's put into the next chapter before you even knew it was coming. I don't know how every story ends. Not every one has as remarkable a reversal as the story of Joseph. Not every relationship is repaired. Not everything always goes the way I want. In fact, almost nothing. But it's a long story. And God is always on the page ahead of us. Our task in those moments is to trust what he's doing. How does the story end? My part is to wait and see. What did Joseph do to fix his story? He lived it. That's it. He was there, tried to be a decent human being, and waited to see what God would do next. And I'm here to tell you that is exactly what you need to be doing.
Well, one of the things we had to do for Dr. Tally was we had to log so many hours. I don't know if you remember that. We had to color in and log so many hours together alone, so much time in groups. You could count a phone call if it was longer than 30 minutes. But we decided to train for a marathon and
Because that was the smartest thing to do.
spent weeks and weeks, just the two of us, running and talking some. Sometimes it was a long, quiet run, but eventually it just started to change. I think, too, the work we were doing on ourselves, we started to look at each other differently.
We used to not go on Wednesday nights because that was the only nights that we could talk without kids. So we would pull up, drop the kids off for class. Sometimes we'd drive around the park and talk. Sometimes we'd sit out in the parking lot and talk. And I remember toward the end of our counseling time, we were parked at a parking lot and just kind of were talking about, the answer is to get plugged into the church 100%, to go serve, raise our kids there, be involved there. And I think for me, that was the turning point of we know what to do. We hadn't been doing it, so let's do it.
And I think one of the things that changed for me was when we went to Dr. Tally, we would have to, if it was I had to say something positive about
I need to be really struggling with that.
in that year, that it just made me really look at how critically I had been looking at my husband and just everything. And it just really made me look at my perspective. And when you want to see good in somebody, you can find the good. And I saw changes in my husband that was definitely, God's hand was definitely in that. I don't think he could have done that on his own.
Dr. Tally didn't change our perspective God changed our perspective. He gave us tools along the way to help us discover that. And out of that came a truism for me for life since then, and that is whether it's marriage or your job or church, you can find what you're looking for. If you want to find good, there's a million things that are good. And if you want to pick it apart, that list could be endless as well. And the second truism that came out of that was the fact that it will always work out in the end. If it's not working out, it must not be the end.
I think in the end, our marriage is much stronger healed than before it was broken.